In the cases of the Soviet writers whom we've read so far, that is of Gorky and Mayakovsky, we've been dealing with figures who've been very close to the center of political power of the revolution. People who lived in urban areas, who had contacts with the people in the highest political position, and who saw the revolution and its immediate aftermaths to a certain extent from the bird's eye point of view. That is, from someone who's looking down from a very high position, both of power and of attention. And of course, in the revolution, they saw enormous possibilities for the people of Russia and for changing the society in particular directions that they had in mind. To be sure, in Gorky's case and Mayakovsky's case, the visions differed, but nevertheless, they had visions overall for the society. And the writer we're going to be talking about now, in the case of Mikhail Sholokhov, we see it from a very different point of view. You might say, if the others saw it from bird's eye view, now we're going to see it from the worm's eye view. We're going to see it from the point of view of people who lived on the ground, who lived far from the center of power, far from the center of ideology and ideas of changing the society. We're going to be dealing with Cossacks, a very particular part of Russian society, from one point of view a very colorful and primitive and perhaps negative element in Russian society, from another point of view a very colorful, a very powerful and a very courageous part of Russian society. In order to understand Sholokhov's major novel, the novel that won him the Nobel Prize eventually, Quiet Flows of Dawn, we have to understand something about the Cossacks and the territory which he describes. The description of the territory in this novel is really extraordinary, even if you've never been there, and I must confess I personally have never actually been there myself. You almost feel that you've been there when you read this novel. You can almost feel the land, the dirt in your hands as he describes it. And of course, this requires something of a knowledge of the background of the Cossacks. The people who became Cossacks, their history goes back to the 16th and the 17th centuries, had of course been serfs the way the overwhelming majority of Slavic people in the Russian Empire had been serfs, that is, slaves on the landed estates owned by the aristocrats. You understand that it's obviously no fun to be a slave. This is not a position that they asked for or that they were in of their own volition. But of course, once they were in the position, most people tended to accept it, for better or for worse. They were on these estates. There was a kind of stability of the society at the time. The aristocracy were the bosses. They were the people who worked the land, and that was more or less the story. However, as in any society, there were always certain people whom this galled most especially. In some cases, these people might have been criminals. In other cases, they might have been adventurers. In still other cases, they might have been people who yearned for a kind of freedom. And sometimes they wanted very desperately to get away from the situation of slavery. The question is, where could they go? If they fled to the east, of course, they fled to Siberia, which at least in those days was virtually an untracked wilderness as far as they were concerned. There might have been one or two who could have made it to Siberia, but it was not really a practical solution. If they fled directly west, what they would do would be to fall into the hands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where people were Roman Catholic. And of course, the Roman Catholics would not deal very gently with those who were Eastern Orthodox, who were of a different religion, and were seen really as almost a different race of people. If they went very far south, they would, of course, encounter the empire of the Turkish Sultan, which was Muslim. And of course, from the point of view of Muslims, they were even more estranged than they would be from the point of view of Roman Catholics. In short, almost all the territory around the Russian Empire was virtually closed off if somebody were looking for some kind of refuge, some place to flee. However, if they went to the southwest, in the territory that now would be somewhere near the border between Ukraine and Russia, they did find very fertile territory just north of the Caucasus, a territory where good farmers could make a good living, where they could get good crops as independent people exploiting the land far from the situation of slavery. And so by ones and twos and sometimes families in the 16th and 17th century, people managed to get there away from the slavery, away from the serfdom that existed in the Russian Empire. Furthermore, just to the south in the Caucasus were people who knew a great deal about horses. And in just several generations of living in this more or less free territory in the steppe, they acquired a tremendous skill in handling horses. Eventually, what occurred was a kind of a freebooters republic, which in Russian was called by the word Siech. These were individual landowners, individual farmers, people who were marvelous on horseback. Of course, with their tremendous skill of horsemanship, they proved to be fearsome warriors on a field of battle. And even though the population down there was much less than either the population of the Russian Empire or of the Sultan's Empire or of the Polish Empire, nevertheless, with their horsemanship, they could be quite effective on the field of battle. And for at least a century and a half, they managed to preserve a kind of a balance of power, throwing their alliances now with the Sultan, now with the Poles, now with the Muscovites, to maintain their independence. Later on in the 17th century, however, it became increasingly clear that the growing power of the empires around them were going to be too much for them to handle, that sooner or later they're going to have to come to some kind of an agreement. And naturally, the ones that they were closest to, the ones whose language they spoke and whose religion they shared, were of course the Muscovites, whose power of course rested in Moscow. So later in the 17th century, a representative of the Cossacks signed an agreement with the Muscovite Tsar, and there was a sort of a give and take in this agreement. The Tsar agreed to respect the Cossack ownership of the farmland in their area and gave them more autonomy than any other group possessed in the Muscovite lands at that time. They were even given the privilege of electing their own rulers, their own leaders. Their ownership of the land was guaranteed. They were not forced to become serfs. And in return, they promised to put their fearsome fighting abilities and cavalry under the command of the Russian army. And as a matter of fact, within a generation or two after that, they became the elite forces of the Tsar's fighting forces, inspiring fear and awe in all those who had to fight against them. If you want an example of what the Cossacks meant on the field of battle, you don't have to go any further than French literature of the 19th century, the novels of Stendhal, who observed very closely Russian troops in the field of battle. In his novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, he describes, as you may remember, we talked about this when we talked about Tolstoy, he describes the field of battle at Waterloo from the point of view of a drunken man, Fabrizio del Dongo. And of course, Fabrizio hears all kinds of noise and confusion around him, and all of a sudden the noise stops. It's totally silent. He can't understand what happened to all the people. When the woman gallops up to try to save him, says, "Where did everybody go?" And she tells him just one word: "The Cossacks are coming." Just the word Cossacks was enough to clear that field of battle, and that gives you a very good idea of what Cossacks meant on the field of battle to forces who were opposing them. And of course, Stendhal had observed this with his own eyes. He knew what he was talking about. In short, by the beginning of the 20th century, there was probably no community of people working the land in Russia who were more loyal to the Tsarist system than that of the Cossacks. Because after all, they had privileges that virtually no other Slavic language-speaking peoples of the empire had. They had never been, I shouldn't say never, but since the 17th century, they had never been serfs. They had never been slaves. And of course, they looked upon the Ukrainian and Russian peasants with a certain kind of condescension and perhaps even contempt. One of the worst words that you could use to describe a Cossack was to call him a peasant. That was something they deeply resented because they were not peasants. They were not people who had been slaves, at least not recently. They were owners of land. They were independent farmers. Sholokhov grew up in this community and obviously developed a deep feeling for its traditions and a wide knowledge of its customs. He came to maturity as a writer in early Soviet times, and he knew that if he wanted to satisfy ambitions as a writer, he had to frame his novel in terms that would not cause the Soviets to prevent its publication. Since, of course, the Cossacks were the element of Russian society that was most loyal to the Tsar, naturally the Bolsheviks saw them as their natural enemies, because they wanted to overthrow everything that had to do with the Tsarist system. They wanted to change the society, so that they saw in the Cossacks very hostile troops, and as a matter of fact, it is true that overwhelmingly the Cossacks fought in the White Army in the Civil War against the Red Army, which supported the socialist government. So that it was not easy to present the Cossacks in a novel writing in Soviet times with any kind of attraction, and yet Sholokhov managed to do this in this novel, and that was quite an achievement on his part. What we see is a Cossack family in a Cossack village. In the beginning of the novel starts out with, the first part of the novel is called Peace, and the second part is called War. This might well have been a conscious reversal of Tolstoy's famous title. You understand, of course, that of necessity, Sholokhov would have to take a very different approach toward the wars that took place at the time of the Revolution from that of Tolstoy, who looked at it from a much broader point of view in the 19th century. And of course, he starts the novel with a character of a family which is going to become the central family in the novel, a man named Prokofy Melikhov. The Sholokhov family is going to be the central family in this novel. Prokofiev is coming back from fighting the Turks, as of course the Cossacks did at that time. The Cossacks were involved in the Turkish wars that Russia fought. But Prokofiev has not only been fighting the Turks, but he brings back a young woman whom he was attracted to when he was fighting the Turks. He brought back a young Turkish, we might say, war bride back to the Cossack village. It's not hard to understand how she would appeal in her, with her foreign ways. There would be a certain sexual attraction to the young Cossack, and he brought her back to be his wife in the Cossack village. Well, you can imagine how the Cossack village would react to this, particularly the women in the Cossack village. They found her totally obnoxious and unacceptable. After all, he could have taken a bride from his own village, and instead of taking a bride from his own village, he took some kind of a foreign woman who had non-Christian ways and actually wore the Cossack pants of her husband, which was a terrible shock to the village at that time. In those days, for a woman to put on pants was something that was virtually unheard of, quite different, of course, from our own day. In short, what Sholokhov shows us is a Cossack village which, for many, many generations, had been almost at one with the nature and the society around it. A Cossack village which had a certain kind of unity, a certain kind of integrity, both in the sense of honesty and both in the sense of completeness. And here we have a foreign element suddenly introduced into it. This is the beginning of terrible changes that are going to happen at this particular time. Well, of course, the women of the village soon have all kinds of superstitious fears of this woman, and particularly when a cattle disease takes place, they are sure that it's her presence that has caused this cattle disease. She's some kind of a witch who has special magical powers because, of course, she's a foreigner, she's somebody they don't understand, and so these magical powers are doing terrible things to the village, and it isn't very long before they decide, well, they have to do something about it. They get the men together, and the novel opens with a hideous scene where the Cossacks of the village come to Prokofiev's house to grab the woman, to trample. Here she is, a pregnant woman with a child, of course, that she's going to have for Prokofiev, for her husband. And they are intending to trample her to death. It's a hideous thing. Prokofiev tries to defend his wife. As a matter of fact, he manages to get to his house and grab a saber, which Cossacks wield with terrible effect, and he actually manages to kill one of the people who's coming to trample his wife, but that doesn't do any good as far as he's concerned. As a matter of fact, it does a lot of evil, because then he's arrested for murder. The woman is trampled to death. However, the women of the village manage to save the infant that she was carrying, and this infant grows up to be the patriarch of the family in the novel. His name is Pantaleimon, and his face bears the marks of his partly Turkish origin. And in him, as I said before, we see the first foreign part of the wedge, which is going to be driven into the reality of a Cossack village by the events of the 20th century, the same way a powerful blow will drive a wedge into a log that you're trying to split. In turn, Pantaleimon grows up and has a son named Gregor, and it's Gregor who's the protagonist of the novel, through whose eyes we see the events leading to the war and the revolution. Gregor also carries a stamp of the foreigner on his face. They see his face as a Turkish face. And in his character, although his training is totally that of a Cossack. It's through Gregor's eyes that we're going to observe these events. Now, Gregor, being a Cossack, has some characteristics that we certainly would regard as terribly negative. He can sometimes be very cruel. He can sometimes be very primitive, and especially in the way he treats women. Today, we would regard this as a terrible breach of humanity. Of course, you have to remember, in making such a judgment, we'd be judging him from our point of view. In the Cossack society of his time, it was something somewhat different. This was something that was taken much more for granted. Very early in the novel, we see him fishing and wading in the cold waters of the rain-swept Don. You know that this novel is called, in English, Quiet Flows the Don, in Russian, Tikhy Don, which literally means quiet dawn. And the novel, the river itself, becomes a kind of a force, almost in some ways a character in the novel. We feel this early on when he's wading in the river trying to use a fisherman's net in order to catch a good fish in the river. We feel the current, we feel the coldness of the river, we soon feel the power of nature in Cossack territory.